Hi, everybody. Okay, Jessica Eves Matthews here. I'm a longtime lawyer, and I've been getting a lot of questions from people about executive orders. And so I thought that I would do a little explainer video so that you can understand what they are, um, and how and when they might be enforced. Thought that might be useful. We'll throw in a little bit of an explanation about the three branches of government, just so that you understand a little bit better, at least get a refresher on how our system works. Okay, so an executive order is basically an order that's issued by the executive, who is the president. So remember that there are three branches of government. There's the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. They all have different appointments of power under the Constitution. And they also serve, or at least they should serve in theory, as checks and balances on each other branch's exercises of their power, if that makes sense. So they're all supposed to sort of be checking each other and balancing each other's powers. So an executive order does have the effect of law, but only with respect to the executive branch. So an executive order can basically be a rule or guidance given by the executive, again, that's the president, to the various government agencies that are under the executive branch on how to operate. Basically, that's all an executive order can do. What an executive order cannot do is it cannot supersede a contract. So say there's a government contract that's contrary to that executive order. So generally, executive orders are going to have an effective date. And so anything that came before that date is not affected by it. And if there's government contracts or some type of commercial contract in place with any government agency, those contracts are not unilaterally changed or revised in any way or nullified by an executive action or executive order. That would require the parties of the contract to negotiate any changes and agree upon them in writing. So generally, executive orders are forward-looking, and so they can limit the way contracts are entered into, terms of contracts going forward for the different federal agencies, but they generally can't have any effect on the past, just so that you guys can understand how this will be interpreted going forward. And so the president cannot unilaterally change those sort of pre-existing relationships. But the president does have the authority to promulgate rules that govern how the federal agencies are operating going forward. So that's generally what an executive order is. It does have the effect of law for the executive branch. So the president cannot issue legislation that would some way would bind the legislative or judicial branches or American citizens in general. It's limited to the executive branch. It is the legislative branch that has the authority under the US Constitution to legislate and to promulgate new laws, federal laws. So we're talking about the federal government here, not state governments. That's a completely separate discussion. There's a lot of power reserved to the states under the 14th Amendment. But that's right now we're talking about the federal powers. So it's Congress that is the legislative branch. So the Senate and the House of Representatives that have the authority under the Constitution to write and pass new legislation. Now, the executive branch, the president, is the one that signs those laws into law, right? So a bill is passed by the legislative branch, and then it's the president that would sign it into law or veto it. So again, that's a check on the power of Congress, legislative the executive is the one that actually puts that law into force or refuses to do so. And the legislative branch, which is Congress in this case, has the ability to also check the president's power. So they could promulgate laws that might in some way modify or affect maybe an executive order. For example, President Biden in 2023, I think it was, issued an executive order on sort of the responsible development of AI, artificial intelligence. Well, he can't limit what Congress does. So Congress can come up with any type of law that they can agree upon uh, regulating AI. And they're not necessarily affected by that executive order. Now, the president could refuse to sign it. So that's going to be a negotiation between the president's office and Congress. But technically, those powers are separate. Then we have the judicial branch, which is the courts. So we're talking the federal level. So we've got the federal trial courts, which are generally the district courts. Then you would appeal from any decision in that court to the federal appellate courts, and then you could appeal from there to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, there are circumstances under which you could appeal directly to the U.S. Supreme Court, but generally that is the the course that you would take in order to get in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Also, the U.S. Supreme Court is not required to take every case that is appealed to it. So you can file an appeal. You could basically request that the Supreme Court would take your case. That's called certiorari, and the Supreme Court can decide whether or not they want to take it. So they pick and choose the cases that they want to hear and rule on, and generally they're cases of novel issues of law or of federal importance, national security, constitutional questions, things like that. So not every case ends up in front of the Supreme Court. And if it doesn't, then it's the highest appeal court that that case has gone to that decision will be the one that stands. So how does that work with executive orders? So the judicial branch has the authority to review the legality and constitutionality of any law promulgated by Congress. Now, it can also review state court issues, but we're not talking about that today. So we're talking about laws passed by Congress and signed into law by the president. So the Supreme Court reviews the legality and the constitutionality of those statutes, and particularly the constitutionality. That's usually a big issue in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. They also will review the legality and constitutionality of executive orders, sort of similar to how they do for a statute. So the executive orders that are being issued this week by President Trump are reviewable by the U.S. Supreme Court. So there are two ways that the U.S. Supreme Court might decide that an executive order is unenforceable. One would be that it's illegal. So an executive order is illegal if it goes against the laws of the U.S. government. So those would be laws passed by Congress. And also if the president has overreached beyond the executive powers, so if he's tried to legislate through an executive order in a way that does more than just binds the executive branch, but tries to bind the legislative branch or U.S. citizens, that's overreaching, that's beyond the powers of the office, that would be considered an illegal executive order. And that would be something that the Supreme Court could overturn. The other way that the Supreme Court might overturn an executive order is if it is in violation of the U.S. Constitution. So that's very similar to what they would do with a statute in determining whether something is enforceable or whether it should be struck down as unconstitutional. So in order to go to court to challenge an executive order, anytime you go to court, you have to have what's called standing. You have to have an injury in fact. So you have to be damaged by that executive order and the enforcement of it. So generally, the president's going to issue an executive order, and then there will be some action taken by a federal agency, which is an extension of the president's office. It's all under the executive branch. And that action harms, say, an employee. Well, then that employee technically would have an injury, in fact, and would then have standing to, now there's more to the analysis of whether someone has standing or not, but generally for you to understand that you can't just go to court, there has to be an injured party in order for there to be a lawsuit. So this week, I think there are a lot of injured parties, or at least they're about to be injured as people are losing their jobs, for example. And you're not having to prove right at the outset when you bring a lawsuit that you're going to win. You just have to be able to make an argument that proves that you have made a case upon which there may be a successful outcome. So you just basically have to plead a case that looks like it's valid and that there might actually be a cause of action. and there's a chance that you might, get a ruling in your favor. If it's completely baseless, then often those cases get thrown out very early in the process. But assuming that there's some validity to it, that's how the process is initiated. So there are attorneys all over the US right now, I guarantee you, working on lawsuits to challenge these executive orders. And those will be their arguments generally, that they're either illegal because they are an exercise of legislative power as opposed to executive power, or they're unconstitutional. So unfortunately, we have a Supreme Court that seems to more often than not favor Trump and make rulings that frankly contort the law in a way that supports Trump's position and are in contradiction of precedent. One other thing I want to point out, the judicial branch is charged with the power to interpret the laws, right? So they are looking at both legislation and executive orders that have been promulgated and determining whether they are legal and whether they are constitutional. Those are generally the two issues that they're looking at. And so, as I mentioned before, the two grounds under which an executive order is going to be challenged are those two, whether it's legal or whether it's unconstitutional. There's a lot of debate about whether the US Supreme Court in particular should be legislating from the bench, I think is the phrase that a lot of people use. And there's a lot of people who talk about originalism, sticking to the original Constitution, really limiting the scope of the powers of the justices, particularly on the Supreme Court. However, it's important to understand that any ruling that comes out of the Supreme Court is law. So in essence, the court is, every time they issue an order, creating new law, because what they're doing is they're either interpreting an existing statute by clarifying it or providing some kind of guidance on how to enforce it and what facts would trigger a violation of that statute. So you end up having sort of a three-part test or a 5-element test or something that the Supreme Court comes up with so that people can understand when they are or are not violating a statute, or when a statute is or is not unconstitutional, for example. Same with executive orders. So the US Supreme Court is promulgating decisions that become law. They become the law of the land just as much as what happens out of the legislative branch and frankly out of the executive branch. But the check on the judicial branch's power, it lies both in the executive branch and the legislative branch, because if the Supreme Court comes out with a ruling, say with respect to whether gay marriage is something that should be protected by the Constitution, if Congress can have a majority of legislators, both in the House and the Senate, that disagree with that Supreme Court ruling, they can decide to pass a statute or pass a bill to override or supersede that Supreme Court decision, right? So they could come up with a statute or a bill that basically says that gay marriage is protected by the Constitution. There's a constitutional right. And then the president would be another check on that, because then it's the president that would actually sign that into law. So they all have to kind of work together, but none of these branches have unfettered power, and they're all in an ideal world supposed to be a check on each other's power. Now we're in a situation right now where Trump and his group of followers control all three houses, or all three branches. So that makes things a little bit more problematic. There is less of a check and balance on the various branches because they all, it appears, are going to be working in concert. So that is concerning. That is not ideal under any scenario. I know we get tired of the fighting in Congress, for example, or the fighting between the US Supreme Court and the president. But we want to see some of that tension, because that means the system of checks and balances is working. And so that's one of my biggest fears and concerns as a lawyer going into this new administration and new congressional session and judicial session for 2025, that we don't have the checks and balances on the system that usually create the guardrails for our constitutional republic. So it's going to be very interesting to see how things turn out. But anyways, I wanted to give you guys a little bit of an explainer so you would understand how these things work together, why the president can issue these executive orders. He can also revoke previous executive orders, which he's also doing this week. He's revoked a number of Biden's executive orders. He even revoked one from LBJ relating to basically DEI, civil rights related issues, and sort of equal protection in hiring practices and things like that. So it's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out. It's going to be a very busy time for lawyers and for the courts. And anyways, I hope this has been helpful. If you have anything else you want me to explain to you, let me know and I'll do another video.